Hello and welcome to today's webcast, The Great North American Drought, Industry Impacts 1 Year Later. My name is Rory King, Director, IHS Supply Chain, and I'll be your host and moderator here for today's event. The event today is hosted by IHS, the leading provider of global supply chain information and analytics. It will focus on insight drawn from the IHS Agriculture Pricing and Purchasing Service, used by agribusiness, financial institutions, and government agencies around the world. The IHS Agriculture Service covers commodity prices, row crops, livestock, and farm income. It equips clients with vital market price and cost information to help make better decisions and recognize millions of dollars in cost savings. Thank you so much for attending. We're pleased to have you join us today. Before we get started, I'd like to familiarize you with today's event by covering a few housekeeping items. We want this to be informative, so feel free to ask a question at any time. To do so, type questions into the Ask a Question area to your right and click Submit. The slides will automatically advance for you during today's event, but if you need help at any time, click the Help icon in the bottom right that you see shown on your screen. Also feel free to join the conversation today on Twitter. Follow us at IHS4SupplyChain and join us in live tweeting by using the hashtag IHS Webcast. Note that that's IHS Webcast, singular. And finally, the most important housekeeping item. We've created a survey with questions about today's event and topics. Your feedback is instrumental in not only helping us improve our events, but our market knowledge and products and services. As a token of our appreciation, we're offering everyone who completes the survey a chance to win a Kindle Fire HD. So please complete the survey, which can be found at the bottom of the webcast console via the survey icon. And if you leave today's event for any reason early, please do let us know why by completing the survey so that we may continuously improve our events. And now to introduce today's presentation. First, we will hear from Mr. Ryland Maltzbarger, who is Principal Economist for the IHS Agriculture Pricing and Purchasing Service. Ryland is widely regarded as a leading agriculture and food chain expert, having responsibility for IHS global crop and livestock services, as well as numerous forecasts, including cotton and sugar. Welcome, Ryland. Next, we will hear from Brandon Clethermos. Brandon is Senior Economist within the IHS Pricing and Purchasing Agriculture Group. Brandon's key area of focus is the continued development, maintenance, and forecasting of U.S. crops. He also provides daily and weekly commentary on current issues affecting the agriculture markets worldwide. Also welcome, Brandon. And with that, we'll get started. I'll turn it over to Ryland Maltzbarger to have us take a look at U.S. and global agriculture market outlook. Thank you. Ryland?
Thank you very much, Rory. This is Ryland Maltzbarger. As Rory mentioned, we are going to cover some U.S. and global agriculture market outlook. Looking at the Great North American Drought, the industry impact 1 year later. To get this started, I'll just go ahead and go through the outline here. So the idea is to the quick introduction here of some background over the last couple years. I'll pass it off to Brandon to go through the U.S. outlook for grains, oilseeds, some supply implications. So as we've added supply and area into production, what's some implications for longer term? Go through an outlook for world grains, world oilseeds, and then he'll pass it back to myself to cover the U.S. cattle supply situation, how that's extended through time, and then a little information about our upcoming multi-client study. So as a background, we've looked here at the last half decade where we've seen more volatility within the market, especially in the pricing sphere, where we've seen previous years kind of a slow movement in prices, kind of a slow movement in area, and now what we've seen among different reasons for demand-driven in the case of the U.S. biofuels mandate, EU mandates, the financial crisis, so the upward movement, the downward drop, followed by some droughts, with wheat-producing countries, as well as more recent drought the last year or so in the U.S. and then some in Argentina. And now I'll pass it off to Brandon to kind of go through where we've been and what we expect.
Thank you, Rylan. After seeing multiple years of balance sheet tightening, not only in the United States, but progressively moving from Russia, Europe, South America, and then ending effectively in the United States last year, we're poised to see a little bit of a strong turnaround, and we're probably to the point we're almost certain that we are going to see something this late in the growing season for 13-14 marketing year. In 2012, we started off the spring. The producers did in just excellent shape. Quick plantings, wonderful weather, and as you can tell, the U.S. drought outlook in 2012 was pretty minimal. Now the May 2013 still showed some of that lingering drought, but for the most part, the Corn Belt was in pretty good shape. By August of 2012, the drought had decimated the Great Plains and the Corn Belt. Now, I should point out the 2013 drought map is actually the end of July, 1st of August, and the most recent one has shown a little bit of turnaround for some of the plains regions in a state such as Kansas, but clearly in a much better position than what we were a year ago. And again, recent rains in some of these dry areas is probably going to start to alleviate some of the dryness in these Corn Belt areas. As a result of the drought last year, the IHS Soft Commodity Price Index rallied to new highs in the late summer of 2012. Since those highs, the index has trended lower as demand slowed and world area responded. The index has been flat for the last 2 months, and the most recent price break was in reaction to old crop futures collapsing from spread unwinding in the soybean complex. So in a nutshell, the guys that were long in your old crop contracts became short, so it pressured the futures markets. Where we are today, at this time, the U.S. weather has kept pollination stress to a minimum for corn and, for the most part, soybeans now. U.S. corn and soybean yields are expected to be below trend line, but at levels well above last year. The USDA has indicated harvest abandonment for corn and soybeans will be above average this fall, presumably given the lateness of the crop planting. On the world front, weather in Russia and Ukraine has been conducive for an early start to harvest, but they did have a little bit of warm, dry weather in their late spring that kind of pulled back some of their production outlook. Cheap wheat supplies are beginning to flood the market, and the second corn crop in Brazil has sidestepped any major yield-reducing scenario such as frost. Chinese imports of U.S. and foreign wheat have been very strong relative to normal, and as a result, the USDA in their July WASDE has increased Chinese wheat imports to 8.5 million metric tons, which is very, very large for China on a percentage change basis. Bottom line, commodity prices are being pressured by the growing reality that world grain balance sheets may actually loosen after 2 years of contraction. Our quarterly price forecast continues to call for declining commodity prices as a result of this production swelling for the 13-14 marketing year and the continuation of supported area in the United States for next year's crop, 14-15. Depending on acreage loss, we may consider revising our corn prices higher to a marketing year average of $4.30 a bushel in our agriculture quarterly U.S. forecast, in our September forecast. For soybeans, they're kind of a wild card yet. Yields, in our opinion, have a greater chance of shrinking due to the lateness of the crop, but we will discuss later. The real question with this year is how much are we going to lose in harvested area, or how much are we going to gain in harvested area. Wheat prices might be considered the most bullish because of the Chinese import potential, the small decline in Russian production, and the potential imports from Brazil because their major supplier, Argentina, has had quite a few issues with their wheat crop the last few years. In an effort to predict USDA production levels, 2013 has been compared to a few other wet years that have induced delayed plantings. Although this year was wet, we feel that looking possibly at 95, 2008, and 2009 as comparisons would probably be better than looking at a year such as 93 with the massive flooding in the United States. These graphs represent the change in U.S. acreage levels from the March prospective planting report, the June acreage report, and finally the October WASDE. For corn in this instance, the October WASDE always witnessed a decline from the June level, albeit very small. For example, in 2009, corn area fell by less than 1%. One other important factor we want to point out is the harvested percentage having a greater chance of possibly changing production levels. If the USDA were to increase the harvested percentage while lowering area by less than 1%, there might be very little change in production at all. For soybeans, the story is a little different. There's no clear increase or decrease. So in this instance, there's probably a greater chance of seeing area supported from the June level. This was the case in 2008, but again, as you can tell, the harvested percentage was quite a bit weaker. It doesn't look like much from a percentage end of it, but for soybeans, that is significant. With so many acres of soybeans being put late into the ground, there's probably a good chance that harvested percentage might fall similar to 2008. Unlike corn, though, August weather is what will influence yields for soybeans and as well as production, where July is more important for corn. As we take a look at potential price impacts for the 2013-14 marketing year, there remains quite a bit of price volatility in regards to this production change. We can look at three different scenarios in respect to price: bullish, bearish, or status quo. In this instance, status quo would represent the June acreage numbers. Now, I should point out these are potential midpoints. So the range for corn might be 25, 30 cents above and below that midpoint. Presumably, that midpoint the range would widen for prices under a higher midpoint, while tighten with lower midpoints as volatility is decreased. In the bearish scenario, planted area for corn is pushed higher to 97.5 million acres, harvested area 89.2, yields at 156.5 bushels per acre. Bullish scenario, planted area is reduced to 96.7 million acres, which is a similar percentage change to the 2009. Harvested area falls to 88 million acres. That is witnessing higher abandonment, and yields settle around 155. Status quo, again, equal to the June acreage levels, using a yield of 156.5. From this, overall production remains under 14 billion bushels, but very close, with prices climbing to a midpoint of $4.80 in the bullish, $4 for the bearish, and $4.30 for the status quo. Under a similar scenario for soybeans, and again, as I mentioned earlier, we want to point out that as a result of the delayed plantings, we feel soybean yields probably have the potential of being closer to 43.5 at this time. We've got about a month and a half yet to see how they're going to share out. Under the bearish scenario, planted area is adjusted higher to 79.2 million acres, harvested area at 78.4, and yields at 44 even. Under the bullish scenario, planted area is reduced to 77.1 million acres, harvested area at 75.5 million acres, and yield at 43.5. Status quo, June acreage numbers of 77.7, harvested area of 76.9, with yields of 44.5. Under the bullish scenario, prices climb to a midpoint of $10.50 a bushel, $9.40 for the bearish, and $9.90 for the status quo. So definitely a little bit of price variability with these two, and we will find out shortly in the next 2 months by October a little bit more of a better understanding of where these areas are going to end up at. For both corn and beans, the current weather forecast is fairly conducive. Abandonment, again, we feel will have a greater sway on production at this time. And it should be noted that corn price trends will also affect wheat in a similar manner. So if corn is pushed higher, it's going to pull wheat along with it. As we look forward into planning decisions for 2014-15, in the northern hemisphere, and specifically the United States, lower prices are expected to pressure area for the U.S. And due to that expectation, a new short-term price risk to the downside has been created. Over the last few years, CRP area has continued to decline, and presumably pasture has switched into more row crop versus hay. So the big question here is, what price pressure would the U.S. see if producers continue to plant a larger area to crops such as corn and soybeans in hopes of higher prices the following 12 months? In this example, IHS is focused strictly on the price impact of 3 prolonged years of higher than forecasted U.S. area compared to our May U.S. quarterly forecast. Of course, the problem would be compounded if other major countries did not retract to the level witnessed in our forecast. So in our global agriculture forecast, we also estimate that suppliers such as South America, European Union, and the FSU also pull back in response to price. For corn, we presume planted area falls from 97.4 million acres this year to 94.3 in 14-15, 91.8 in 15-16, and 90.2 in 16-17. Harvested percentage remains constant at 91%, and yields are identical with our May forecast yields for those particular yields. From a demand perspective, corn for ethanol remains right in line with our May forecast estimates, mainly because the demand sector is being squeezed, and more so corn for ethanol is probably going to be stagnant around that 5 billion bushel mark. But food, seed, and industrial category as a whole is going to react slightly to lower prices, increasing by less than 1%. Feed and residual category will also increase because of the larger harvest size. Residual use tends to increase when you have a larger harvest for corn. There would probably be in that short period reaction from the pork and poultry sectors expanding production because of those lower corn prices. What we find is that ending stocks grow and prices fall within those years by 13, 12, and 6% respectively. For corn, there's a strong price risk surrounding that robust export path that's currently being forecast in this scenario. This would pressure prices to a greater extent if these other countries push the U.S. out of the export market because they themselves have not reduced production. For soybeans, more than seeing a pullback of area, it's more so a flat area type scenario. We presume soybean planted area is flat, with this year at 77.7 in 14-15, falls to 77.1 in 15-16, and 76.3 in 16-17. Harvested percentages, just like the corn scenario, remain constant with our May forecast at 99%, and the yields are identical from the May forecast. Ending stocks again move higher, and prices decline from the May forecast by 9, 10, and 3% respectively. For soybeans, there is a greater risk surrounding crush estimates, the U.S. domestic crush estimates, more so than export risk. The reason for this is U.S. exports of soy products, your soybean meal and soybean oil, is what increases, pulling U.S. crush higher. Again, if the world demand falls for soy products, because again they're getting it from other countries, this crush would decline, and these would more than likely, a good portion of these would default back in the ending stocks, pressuring prices. So the outlook here is that we feel in our forecast that producers are going to react to lower prices, not only in the United States, but as well as the rest of the world. And the caveat here is that if these areas that producers have brought in from CRP, have brought in from pasture, they do not go into some sort of fallow state or pull back, it's going to compound the problem, which again will feed directly into farm income and lower the row crop farm income position. Again, some of this will probably be offset from the livestock producers, but again, this just compounds each year as we keep area more supported. So for in the U.S. in the short term, we expect higher harvest price volatility. This fall as a result of the late planted crop for corn and soybeans. one way or the other, a frost headline will at some point provide bullish support. They're already talking about that. It just hasn't gained a lot of support yet, mainly because we are in the beginning of August. We don't foresee any type of rally back to $6, but let's say that the frost forecast is 2 weeks, 3 weeks ahead of normal. Maybe we see a rally to the $5.50 and the DEES corn futures contract in Chicago. Same with soybeans. We see a rally closer to that $12.50 on the November futures. On a little side note, back in May, NOAA had released their hurricane forecast and called for an above-normal hurricane season with the possibility the season could be very active. Again, it's been fairly quiet, and I believe NOAA probably either today or tomorrow is in the process of releasing a new forecast, so any type of mention of hurricane because of the lateness of the crop disrupting harvest will also be bullish. So the big question, following the northern hemisphere grain harvest this year, will prices be low enough to deter acreage expansion in South America? In that regard, we expect producers in Brazil and Argentina to switch to more soybeans at the expense of corn as margins are squeezed. Now, when we talk about the southern hemisphere, their 13-14 crop will actually be planted this fall. The northern hemisphere 13-14 crop was planted this past spring. Now, besides weather, price volatility will be influenced by upcoming USDA reports, which could change our current downtrend that we're witnessing in the futures markets. On August 12th, the August WASDE will be released. That's this coming Monday. Might show a little area revision with U.S. soybean plantings. NASS had come out and said that they were going to resurvey soybean producers to see if they had actually planted their area in their June acreage report. But normally the USDA does not make very many changes in the August when it comes to area. That's more so reserved for October. Again, nothing for corn we expect at this time. There's a greater chance that corn yields, because of recent weather, will be left unchanged or increased rather than being reduced, while soybean yields probably be left unchanged because, again, this report was being compiled in July, so August weather is what makes soybeans. On September 12th, the September WASDE will be released. It's going to continue to adjust your harvest yields based on these weather. On September 30th, we could have a little fireworks. The quarterly grain stocks report usually catches somebody off guard, whether you're a bull or a bear. The stocks in this report will represent the ending stock level for all September-August marketing year crops. In this instance, corn and soybeans. So what's released in this report will be 2012-13 ending stock levels for corn and soybeans. It also set the level of beginning stocks in the 2013-14 marketing year, which again has impact on the carryover witnessed in this new marketing year. It also indicate whether or not wheat feedings during the summer months of 2013 fell within expectations, and the same on corn. In the June quarterly stocks report, trade was a little bit shocked because corn use was a little stronger than what they thought. Then finally, in the short term, on October 11th, the October WASDE is released. It'll be one step closer to figuring out final production numbers for 13-14, and this is where typically the USDA will adjust their planted and harvested area for all spring planted crops. So they incorporate in the FSA branch of the USDA, preventative plant claims, as well as insurance. So this wraps up our look into U.S. risk and the commodity picture for the next few months. Now we'll move on to the world view. U.S. and Brazilian corn area will continue to drop as price response for 13-14. Brazilian exports are forecast to pull back for corn in 13-14, but remain at historically stronger levels. Again, more competition for the U.S. market. Chinese corn area will continue a trend-like growth to satisfy their growing domestic demand, and the government support still favors wheat corn and rice over crops such as soybeans. Imports on a percentage basis will grow significantly, but from an absolute standpoint, nothing in the short term surpassing 10 million metric tons. Unlike corn and soybeans, wheat yields grow at a slower pace, a little less technology advancements than what you see in corn yields. Because of this, wheat area is more stagnant. Again, Russia will remain a key exporter. And with the weather volatility, this could add a somewhat bullish surprise from time to time as Russia struggles with their weather. Chinese wheat imports are expected to surge in 2013-14, but forecast to decline in the following years. Production is seen rebounding in 14-15. What happened this year is they had some detrimental weather that hurt their winter wheat crop, and it also lowered some of their quality. So while they're importing U.S. wheat, they're dealing with needing a higher quality wheat to replace what they lost because of weather this year. World rice has been one of the only grains that has actually seen price pressure from growing supplies since 2012. The main risk for rice price, as well as continued production growth from area, is the fog surrounding the Thai governmental policy of the paddy pledging price. The Thai government has decided to hold monthly rice tenders to help fund next year's season. They've also mentioned that they're working with their farmer groups to decide on a new pledging level, as well as limiting household total amount received per household. So they're attempting to export. It gets to be a little tough because world prices are below that level. The government doesn't want to end up losing a large amount of revenue from lower rice sales, so that kind of conflicts with what's going on with the exporters purchasing the rice and the government selling it. For India, rice production has benefited from the monsoons this year, and they've mentioned they're off to a really good start. South American soybeans are expected to see a modest expansion in 2013-14. Again, this is a crop that will be planted this fall. The stronger inventories will weaken the price incentives and will ultimately keep expansion stagnant the next couple of years. Canada, Ukraine, and Australia look to remain the top exporters of canola or rapeseed globally. There is some growing, better winter rapeseed planting and growing conditions in several EU countries this year, though. Russia is seen recovering from their poor sunflower seed area in 2012-13 and 13-14, as well as is continuing their trend higher. This concludes our U.S. and world grain outlook and oilseed outlook. I will now turn the presentation back over to Rylan, and he's going to discuss a little bit of the U.S. cattle outlook.
Thank you very much, Brandon, for what you've covered and all the good information. As I go forward, what I'll do is I'll cover the U.S. cattle supply issues, how we've extended the price, the cycle out, what that means to beef production, and what that means to the price outlook going forward. So basically, seems that we've popped back here. Here we go. A little slide issue there. What we have here going forward is, and I'll give a little background on this slide here. On the left-hand scale, we actually have heifer retention, so basically going to the breed herd. And on the bottom scale, we're actually looking at inventories within the U.S. So basically, as a historical perspective, as we see in the 1990 through 96, is back in 1990 we have a signal to say, let's increase inventories. So they held back heifers and they increased inventories over the the 5-year or 6-year period, and then we went into the down cycle after that. And so you saw the heifer retention and then the run up in inventories to follow. Now 2004, is following the BSE issue, so that was less of a supply issue, more of a demand issue, followed by then various supply issues from importing, cattle from Canada and various other issues going on with the BSE scare. Now, as we've seen over the last couple of years, we've actually reached that kind of low point in heifer retention, followed by declining inventory. So we're reaching that point in the cycle where we needed to turn around, increase heifer retention to signal expansion. But what's happened with the drought, with the issues with the available supplies of feed, higher prices of feed, higher prices of forages as well, and lack of forages in some cases this spring, we actually are seeing a slowdown in, continued slowdown in actually heifer retention, which would lead to an increase in inventories as we move forward. And with the most recent report without the USDA putting out their July report for cattle and inventories, we look at the LMIC to give some direction. They're even more pessimistic on how the outlook going forward into 2014, 2015. So just to put a little qualitative behind the numbers and behind the chart here, basically we've seen heifer slaughter slowed in the first half with the idea that we're going to see cow inventories increase, but that's not really how it's going. We look to placements have changed and we've actually increased or decreased the level of cattle on feed despite a reduction in inventories. Now, placements weight have gone higher, so that looks for less of the breed going into herding and more of it going into the meat supply for this year. So going forward, our expectations is basically we're extending the cycle out multiple years. So we're actually going to have lower inventories, for 2013. We're going to look to push the cycle out another year and maybe even 2 or 3 more years to actually have enough production to actually see a breeding herd retention in order to see a major recovery in inventory supply. So what does that mean to beef production? Basically, we're at the worst beef production we've seen in about 20 years, even lower even lower than the BSE you saw in 2004, but lower supplies than we've seen since 1990. Now, on the opposite side of that, some of the gains and efficiencies and weight gains will help to offset some of this, but ultimately we're looking for a drop in beef production this year, followed by stagnation, if not another drop in beef production in 2015. So this opens the door for consumption of poultry and pork, who can better respond to feed cost decreases. And as we can see here, this is our expectation of the previous slide, where we see breeding herd heifer retention did not increase, but potential for inventory increase. And then we'll see that extend out and hopefully recovery back through the following years after that. So what this means to prices is, as we move forward through time over the last few years, is that we saw the beef prices because of the supply situation, but also because of feed costs increase over time. And as we moved into 2013, you would have expected with the higher feed cost, to actually have higher beef prices again another year. But the pushback from consumer demand played a part into this, and then also the available supplies of pork and poultry, and the changing, available supplies over the next year will also keep the beef prices from continuing to increase. And so we see more stagnation, peaking in beef prices, but we'll see lower prices in pork and poultry as they're able to faster respond to a lower feed cost. And so we see consumption declining in beef, and we see more substitution over the next few years with pork and poultry. So as you've seen with what I've gone through for the U.S. cattle beef information and what Brandon's gone through as well, these are all products and information that we have available in the U.S. Global Ag Services available here with IHS. Some of the upcoming information that we have coming forward as well is that to get a better understanding of how this all works, maybe some of these supply dynamics of adding extra harvested area globally, as well as increased volatility in weather. We're actually putting together a multi-client study at the end of this year to look at increased yield variability across all major producers and importers. So we got increased El Nino, La Nina patterns, drought conditions, impacts of drought in North America, European Union, FSU, changes in monsoon patterns in India. So we're going to go through a full multi-client study going out to 2030, looking at kind of the difference between our baseline, which assumes an average weather, and then seeing what the kind of delta is over time of who this affects, how much area is it continuing to keep in production, what's the volatility around prices over time, so where's the lows, where's the highs. Now the point estimates year to year will not be as much interest to most of you, but more so of how it's going through time, how much the price is expected to stay above, and how it may even feedback through other industries such as macroeconomic concerns, high-risk area of food security, how it may change policies, global agriculture policies, and get some of that feedback that you receive through the other parts of IHS, of macro, energy, and so forth. Participants in the study that will pick this up and may give us more information of what they would like to see, anything from the direct input producers for agriculture, chemicals, fertilizers, machinery, so forth, to food chain participants, transportation, investments, and most companies around the world that are involved and have indirect costs associated with agriculture. So I'd like to thank you all very much. Please give us your questions. We'll address those after Rory finishes up.
Thanks, Rylan. As Rylan indicated, we'll start taking a look at questions that have been streaming in. As we do so, please fill out the survey that we discussed at the beginning of the event. Did you find today's presentation informative? What agriculture issues are top of mind in your organization? And obviously, how can we continue to make these events more valuable to you? These are all things that we'd like to know, so please click the survey icon at the bottom of the screen and take a moment to complete the brief survey. Also, as a reminder, if you're interested in participating or learning more about the IHS multi-client study on long-term weather variability impacts outlined by Rylan, please complete our survey where there's an opportunity to indicate your interest or send an email to webcasts@ihs.com. That's webcasts, plural, @ihs.com. So now let's take a look at some of the questions that we have. First question here I have is for Brandon. Brandon, earlier you discussed a corn bushel forecast for ethanol. And the question is your $5 billion corn bushel forecast for ethanol consistent through 2017?
It is, and plus more. There is no minus the 5 billion bushels worth of corn. It bounces around between 5 and 5.3. Now, one important factor on that, and the EPA has just come out and made some statements that possibly could change or have no impact at all, depending on when they finalize the rules next year. But this assumes that you will continue your 15 billion gallons worth of corn-based ethanol, or starch-based, but again being filled mostly by corn in the United States. So that will require your 5 to 5.4 billion bushels worth of corn, and there is an increasing yield from ethanol that we currently have in our assumptions. One thing that's very important to remember is that this assumes an increasing blend wall. In our particular forecast, don't see a whole lot of growth in E85. This would come from higher blend rates such as E11, E12. By 2017, I don't think it gets out that high, but in our typical forecast, we see something by the end possibly reaching E13. But again, this might be a little bit of a policy struggle. And if the EPA comes in and makes any changes next year in 2014, that could change this forecast. And if that would occur, that would pressure corn prices because you would probably end up losing a good little chunk of your demand forecast.
Great. Thanks, Brandon. We have another question for you. What specifically is the risk during mature or harvest, and is the potential impact as big as drought during pollination?
So this is great because we've got this. 2012 we had the drought and pollination issues, and this year we could potentially have a harvest issue. So with the corn as an organism, after it gets over a certain temperature, the corn plant will literally shut down and go into defense mode. So it won't pollinate, and that's kind of what we saw last year in some of these very hot, dry areas. Even if you received some rain following pollination, but it was so hot and dry that the plant literally did not pollinate, it wouldn't matter how much rain. So it's a total loss at that point. Now this year, what we have a late crop. We are behind in the dough stage as well as tasseling. So we're more than likely going to be behind in harvest because of this. What we have to watch for this year is the crop pollinated for a majority of the United States under mostly ideal conditions. It was cool, but again, we didn't have the heat that we had last year. So even some of these areas that fought low moisture probably did come out in a much better place than what they were last year. So there's a lower amount of risk from a drought during pollination and hot, dry conditions during pollination versus what we'll see in a frost. Your frost is more than likely going to come in your northern states that have your highest risk. So as long as that frost does not extend down into central Iowa, too far down into Illinois, Ohio, Indiana, places like that, you're probably going to see a production loss on a much smaller scale this year.
Great. Thank you, Brandon. Ryland, we have a question on bioethanol. What is the expected long-term impact of bioethanol production on corn availability and prices?
Yes, as we go forward, looking longer term, there's definitely been a major change from the policy perspective globally on looking at using bioethanol, biofuels in general. So what we see, we'll just specifically stick with the U.S. to start out with, is that we actually see more of a stabilization, if not a stagnation, going forward as the policies either to increase supply or increase demand within the U.S. For bioethanol consumption will be limited. And so as we move forward, unless we see a major increase in the crude oil price, and the supplies of gasoline or various other consumption such as diesel and the effect on biodiesel, we actually see basically a long-term stagnation. And so what that means for corn, and I'll follow that up with EU as well, is that we don't see any major expansion in the EU for bioethanol for corn either. Obviously, they have more diesel and they have more other ethanol sources such as sugar beets, wheat, and so forth. But what we see is basically we see more of a floor being put onto the corn price. So as long as policy doesn't major shift in RFS, which we might head that direction in a couple of years to where we see a down play on corn, depending on congressional action, then we'll see more of a floor price. Not so instead of like $2 a bushel seen over the 90s. We'll see more of that $4 a bushel floor price kind of put in, depending on cost of production and various other things, and stagnation of consumption, transportation consumption in the U.S. Now, we do see some opportunities for other uses, and you're going to speak with some of the chemical folks within IHS about this of bioplastics and biousage. That is an opportunity going forward, but will it replace the kind of consumption that we see for transportation? No. The other side of that is bioethanol from sugarcane is still got significant growth potential, mainly driven by Brazil, though. So it mostly will be country specific for the sugarcane ethanol, as they find it a direct energy security issue within Brazil. So they will still have some policy incentives to help expansion of consumption of ethanol within Brazil. And so there's some arbitrage opportunities here, let's say for corn. Let's say if we keep a long-term low corn price, well, if the sugar price continues to be buoyed up, it's at a pretty current low compared to a few years ago, If it pushes back up, as we expect it will to some extent, if we see that sit there for about 5 years, obviously there's opportunity for export corn to Brazil to fill up some of their own consumption. The only problem with that is it becomes a major obstacle from the Brazilian side as they want to support their own industry. So they may throw up some barriers to trade and other things if it lasts too long. And plus, the U.S., any support that comes from congressional through RFS and so forth, if we're exporting a significant quantities to other countries, we may see a political pushback in the U.S. on any subsidies or, not subsidies, but any kind of support that goes to the bioethanol industry within the U.S.
Great, thank you, Ryland. And I want to remind everybody to complete the survey, especially if you have to leave for any particular reason. If you could just provide us your quick feedback, that would be great. Just want to remind people that they can ask a question using the Ask a Question feature. And I've received a number of questions about the playback of today's presentation. Yes, there will be a live playback of today's presentation that will be available on demand approximately 24 to 48 hours after today's event. So you will be able to access that the same way that you access this event using the same website URL that you have in order to log into this event. You'll use that same information to log into the on-demand version 24 to 48 hours from today. I have a question here for Brandon. Brandon, what is the most effective way to manage the risk of rising corn prices?
And that is a very tough question to have a broad answer to, because it's more so our year-to-year changes in production. So maybe we'll attack it for next year. We go into the trade again, your price discovery mechanism of the futures markets. They're watching the USDA reports as well as your other major countries. So a big report as we go into the start of 2014 calendar year would be our quarterly grain stocks. So are we chewing through the corn that we think we are from the feed sector? Again, we can watch export levels, we can watch ethanol levels on a weekly basis, and you have a pretty good handle on a majority of the market. But again, the feed and residual is kind of up in the air. So we watch these reports, and it's gotten to be the point that, especially with this higher price volatility, that things get overdone before these reports, either to the up or downside. So we've seen over the last 2 years, and again, we've had these record high prices, and the market's going to continually change, and once it settles down, this option may kind of become a little bit less viable. But when they overdo it to the upside, or when they overdo it to the downside, and they get all bulled up or all bared up right before the report, sometimes that becomes a buying or selling opportunity, just because the market gets overextended on one side. But unfortunately, in our forecast, we always assume average weather and a continued trendline yield growth. So into the future, we're always pressuring prices slightly because production's always growing. And that's why we've really wanted to move to this multi-client study, because there is a lot of question. As we scatter production out across the world, you increase the likelihood that one of these regions could witness adverse weather. We've moved soybean production to South America. Now we're factoring in the two different weather anomalies, one that is bad for South America, great for North America, and vice versa. So in this study, how would we manage that? It gives us a little bit of an idea of who that will affect and what that's going to do to prices. What we see today with that is probably a lot more volatility. We can always hedge the futures markets with options or futures themselves to kind of temper some of that. But again, it's a very tough question to answer with broad in the next couple of years. It's more so 6 months out, a year out. But using these market factors that are overdone can become a little bit of a buying opportunity.
Thank you, Brandon. This next question might be a little vague in nature, but I'll ask it to Rylan nonetheless. Rylan, we had a question come in at the very beginning of the event about with supply being replenished, what does the global demand picture look like now? Can you comment on that question?
Yes, thank you, Rory. Basically, as we've moved through time, we've had some major demand upticks with some of the policy-led with biofuels, and so that's added some quicker demand. We've seen some growth in China and growth in various other regions as well. But now with supply being replenished and we see a tapering off of some of those demand pictures, we see a much slower growth in the global demand picture going forward. We've actually seen a slowdown in some of the food consumption, or at least growth in per cap, as well as a slowing in population within China, so or at least slowing of growth. But in China, so that's going to affect some of the major increases in demand that we saw coming through the 90s and coming through the 2000s. And then we had, following that up with some, policy-led biofuel demand. So what we're actually seeing is a slower demand picture. And some of this, so let's say in the case of beef, some of it's supply-led. So, you can't return as much beef supply to the system as fast as, most of the slaughtered heads will take 2 to 3 years to work after 1 year of increasing the breeding supply. So, obviously, pork and poultry can grow much faster, but some of these demand pictures have been sitting out there with high growth for food consumption and various other, points of interest that's been in a lot of the media over the last 10 to 20 years, where FAO came out and said, well, we need a double global food consumption by 2050, as we did with their own Global Harvest Initiative initial 2050 study. We were already down at more of that 75% growth level expected going forward at that point. So, and as with a lot of the studies that we've done, longer term and shorter term, is the fact is that we see, population slowing down. There's macroeconomic impacts as well. We see a slowing of, the per cap growth in dollars per cap in most of the developing regions starting to impact agriculture as well. And so either the number of people we're adding to the food system or the number of disposable income that's being added to the system has slowed over the last few years. And so that's changing some of the dynamics that were expected from other organizations, let's say earlier in the 2000s. So we actually see basically global demand picture being a little bit weaker over the next 10 years, definitely, than we saw in the 2000 to 2010 period. And now with supply being able to respond, and the fact is that we pulled a lot of acreage in globally, and we're seeing some increases in yields and some efficiency done in some of these other regions as well. So we do see a pullback in price longer term, in across multiple ag commodities, a weakening of price. Obviously, the other side of that coin is the since it is all more trade dependent, as people or countries may throw up trade issues or trade barriers if they have a short-term supply issue, or they start holding a significant amount of stocks, we could see more volatility into this picture. And that's the other side of it, is that we see increased volatility, so we see a higher range moving upwards and downwards than we saw probably over the last 30 years average. And some of that's because of policies. A lot of it's to do with policies and stock holdings and available supplies that are sitting out there at any point compared to the amount of consumption that's always sitting out there. So overall, a weaker price situation, but with an increased level of volatility going forward.
Great. Thanks, Ryland. We've had a lot of interest and questions about the multi-client study, but more generically, I think if people are wondering, what is a multi-client study in brief, and can you just explain the format of a multi-client study for those who are interested?
Yes, for the multi-client study, which we've done a few over the last decade or so, going within the ag group, is the idea here is that we're going to take some input from clients and what they could get out of it. And we're going to put out a perspective here to look at, okay, this is what we're looking at. This is how we're going through the process of looking at yield variability. This is how we're going to push it through the system and see impacts. Now, what's the biggest interest from your side too is from customers and non-customers that would be interested in this over the next when we finish the study, so we can show you those impacts through the industries that are most important to you. And so what we're going to do is, elicit some feedback from clients that are sitting out there, and then we're going to actually run the study through the ag models that we already have in place. For those of you who do get the ag services longer term, you understand what the output generally is, but we're going to then incorporate it through all the different multi-levels of looking at, maybe through energy or maybe through security, to put out in qualitative and a quantitative. The very important part, we do quantitative with this, part two, to see impacts, so you can use that to address your own long-term risk and own long-term objectives within your company of how you want to address your supplier risk. Are you going to diversify supplies from, maybe instead of just rice from Thailand, are you going to start pulling it from other countries, or are you going to, diversify your sales because you can see that, there's going to be more volatility in developing regions or non-developing regions. And so that's what we're going to do. We're going to elicit some information from you, how you could use this the best, and then we're going to incorporate this into our own structure here to get the impacts and provide a solution to you.
Great. So as a non-specialist myself, Ryland, it sounds like really anyone who has a stake in the agriculture or agribusiness industry, whether that's on the supply side or the demand side, would be able to participate with other peers in a similar situation and benefit from this study. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. It's going to go up and down, depending on how you could use it. Obviously, most directly would be input clients who look to sell machinery or fertilizers or seeds or invest into industries that do that. That's probably going to be the first stage. But you can look at it as a target, as the people going to be impacted the most. They would be, right center because they're selling into the industry. But the next stage is also going to be, political governments or policy implications or risk of, let's say, an energy company that's or mining company in South Africa that's got maybe more concerns based around food security, or even in the Southeast Asia, all over the world that with the high diversity for most of the companies that we work with nowadays. The impacts are going to be there, and it's going to be felt. So, and we're going to elicit information from our other parts of IHS. We have automotive groups, we have energy groups, we have macroeconomic groups to get some of these impacts. And so you can see the multiple threads where it goes through not just the direct industry that's associated with that, but it goes through all the other ones that will also impact them as well.
Great. Thanks, Ryland. So with that, we're right at the top of the hour, so I would encourage everybody with the few seconds remaining that as I wrap things up here, that they take the time to fill out the survey. We very much appreciate your feedback, good, bad, or otherwise, so please do send us your feedback and let us know what you're thinking about today's event and the topics that we described. And this concludes our event, The Great North American Drought, Industry Impacts 1 Year Later. I'd like to thank everyone for joining us and thank our speakers as well, Mr. Ryland Maltzbarger and Mr. Brandon Kleethermes. Thank you, gentlemen. It was a great event. And as I mentioned earlier, the recording of today's event will be posted within 24 hours to the same website link or URL that you used to access today's event. So if you want to share this with colleagues, if you would like to come back and take a look at the material yourself, it will be available within 24 hours. And in addition, the winner of the Kindle Fire for completing our survey will be notified within the next 2 weeks. So again, thank you for joining us and have a great day. Bye, everyone.